Good evening, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of World Affairs and Marines Memorial Association, we are delighted to have joining us this evening C.J. Chivers, senior writer at the New York Times, and Kate Hoyt, California director of Vet Voice Foundation. In 2009, C.J. Chivers was part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for coverage from Afghanistan and Pakistan. Mr. Chivers served as an infantry officer in the United States Marine Corps in the Persian Gulf War and on peacekeeping duty during the Los Angeles riots. He is the author of The Gun, and most recently, The Fighters, Americans in Combat in Afghanistan and Iraq. Kate Hoyt joined the U.S. Army Reserve in 2001 at 17 and served for 8 years, including as an Army photojournalist in Balad, Iraq, from 2004 to 2005. She previously worked at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs in digital and for now Senator Tammy Duckworth, and in communications for the Office of Congressional and Legislative Affairs. My name is Tim Callahan, and I'm a program officer here at World Affairs. If you enjoyed tonight's discussion and you're interested in learning more about the organization, I will be around after the program, so please introduce yourself. We're recording tonight's program, so please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Kate Hoyt. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you to the World Affairs for bringing CJ to the Bay Area for this important discussion, to the Marines Memorial for hosting us. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. It is my pleasure to be here for a conversation with CJ. He joins us this evening to discuss his new book, The Fighters, a book that follows 6 stories of those who have served at the ground level throughout Iraq and Afghanistan. So let's jump in.
Kate asked me to read. This book is purposefully and unapologetically personal from the perspective of those of the lower and middle rank who served in the 2 recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's a euphemistic way of saying, in places, it's graphic. To capture the personal experience of the wars, you have to show what those experiences were. So I'm going to read a section here about a petty officer, corpsman, who served in an infantry unit. He had signed up quite literally and explicitly because he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to save lives, and this was the first life he saved. He'd saved the life of his roommate, who'd been shot through the head by a sniper a few minutes before in Karma, Iraq. Many of you know where Karma is. It's in the agricultural zone outside of Fallujah. And his reaction, I was with him when this happened, his reaction surprised him. Kirby sat in the front seat, his hands and arms and legs wet with his friend's blood. It was clotting, sticky and still warm. He held Smith's helmet. He turned it over to look at where the bullet had passed through. The bullet rolled inside. It was an armor-piercing 7.62 by 5.4R round. It had zipped through the front of the helmet and then the top of Smith's head. Kirby lifted it out and inspected it, rolling it in his hand. It had kept its shape. Now he put it in his pocket. Nausea came in waves. Outside Weapons Company's Marines were rushing into the house where they had heard the sniper might have hidden. They detained 2 men. Kirby had not been ordered out. He stayed in his seat, listening to the radio reports, waiting to be called, trembling with an energy he could neither channel nor contain. Tears streamed down his face. He stared at his bloody hands and at the stains on his legs and his lap where he had cradled Smith's head. He shook uncontrollably. He rocked back and forth in the seat. Never before had he saved a life. He had thought it would be cool. Instead, he felt guilty. He had seen the entrance and exit wounds and the torn brain matter and had a sense of what was missing. Some of it was inside the helmet on his lap. Kirby could visualize the path of the steel bullet through his friend's skull. If Smith survived the trip to the first hospital, if he made it through stabilization and surgery and the transfer to Germany, what kind of life could he expect? Kirby had acted in the moment, holding emotions in check so he could do his job. Now his emotions broke free. He had a chance to think past the second-by-second sequence and tasks of life-saving steps. He was not sure what saving a life meant. Did I do that for him, Kirby wondered, or for me? He did not know whether Smith was even still alive. There was no medic on the Huey. He might die on the way. Kirby had done what he had most wanted to do and was trying not to vomit.
Thank you. So can you talk to us a little bit about the men that you write about and why you wanted to share these specific stories?
So Kirby's one of 6 principal characters. arguably 7 or 8, depending on how you count them. But what I wanted to do was to find a set of characters who would operate like an ensemble or a garage band. In other words, who they were distinct from each other. They worked or served in different places and times in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were representative of different phases in the war, and that if you strung them together chronologically, you'd get a sense about how the wars had evolved and how the experience of fighting in the wars changed over time. So to do that, I built it around the infantry. Why? I mean, I'm a former infantry officer. It's what I knew. It's my community. It's my language. It's an area where I tend to be able to understand things. And then, of course, the infantry doesn't work alone. So that's why there's a corpsman in the book. The infantry in Iraq and Afghanistan was kept alive by rotary wing air support and close air support. So there's one of each of them. There's a F-14 pilot who became an F-18 pilot over the course of the book, and a Kiowa helicopter, scout helicopter pilot. You know, the Kiowa is basically a phone booth with a rotor on top and a 50 cal to the side. And there's a Special Forces NCO, because they certainly needed to be represented. And then there's a, think of them as an accidental platoon commander. Everyone here who served in an infantry battalion knows the type. Someone gets arrested for driving while intoxicated right before the deployment. And so he was in the S2 shop and was assigned to take a rifle platoon to Afghanistan on very short notice. In fact, the first time he took his platoon to the field was in the largest helicopter assault the Marine Corps has participated in since Vietnam. So those were the characters. The idea was, like I said, a garage band, all these people who tell a different story in a different place and time, in a different experience, that together, strung together in simple chronological fashion, you could follow the arc of these conflicts from the low-level experience and see everything from the changes in doctrine to the changes in equipment to the changes in the enemies, because the enemies changed dramatically across this time period. And that was the idea. Find 6 people who would tell something like a comprehensive story.
Thank you. So this book almost bleeds on the paper with the amount of detail you have in these stories. Can you talk to us about your writing process?
Some of you know me, I'm a pretty obsessive person. I started from the position of having seen a significant amount of this firsthand. If you've read the book, you know that, the Roman numerals in the beginning, the preface, I declare my point of view. I thought I had to do that as an act of public honesty. I declare my skepticism for how these wars were conducted and my disappointment in the strategy and the political leadership of the country in both parties. I'm not a member of a party, for the record. That takes a few pages, but only a few. And then I disappear entirely from the book. And page 1 to 300 or whatever that follows, you're totally in the heads and the experiences of the characters. I saw a lot of it firsthand, but I don't put myself in the book. As you know, because many of you have been in combat, you often don't understand your own combat in the first person, just with your own head. It takes time, and you have to go around to the other people who were there. So in the case of many of these characters, even where I had seen things, I didn't assume I knew anything. I just thought that was a foundation to begin a conversation with. And I would tell them, I'm here basically to download your brain. And we would do a series of immersive interviews over time, some in person, a lot of them on the phone, over the course of years. And then I would say, I now need to see any records you have, any emails that you sent, any letters that you sent home. As you also know, many people come home from the war having looted a lot of internal reports. So there's storyboards and after-action reports. There's journals and photographs. All of that I would try to assemble. Then I would build a social map around the person. Who else was at this? And will they talk to me? Often I knew those people. Sometimes I didn't. And then I would try to do the same process in a narrower sense for the scenes that I was describing or the incidents. I try to go to everyone who was there, who was willing to talk with me and get their account. And I end up with boxes of material. And then I'd sit down and write it. And there were always big holes because there's a lot I don't know. I mean, I had to describe what it's like to fly a helicopter. I don't know the first thing about flying a helicopter. So I then would get groups of helicopter pilots and I would write paragraphs, and I would put them in front of them to kind of critique the facts, like, you know, how many positions are there on the safe arm switch on the Kiowa helicopter, because I was trying to recreate exactly what people did. And when I got all of that done, I have what's called a draft. And the first thing you need to know about any draft, if you're honest with yourself, any draft any of us have ever written is laden with error. So now you got to find the error. There's no sin in an error in a draft. There's a big sin in an error in a published book. So I then went back to all the characters and read them over the phone, sentence by sentence, or in some cases sent them pages. And I enlisted a number of technical reviewers, including Marine Battalion commander and executive officers, company commanders, fellow pilots, people who would sit and read through it methodically and look for my errors. And they all spotted a few. I incorporated those repairs or fixes, if you will, and then we had a book.
Thank you. Let's circle back on strategy and policy. I know through reading the book, some of the characters looked at the big picture of their service, and some didn't really focus on that. They were just happy they brought their men home. We talked a little bit about upstairs about the number of troops that we brought into these countries. Can you just elaborate on your thoughts?
I can tell a lot of this room's been in combat, and you know, I think, or would agree generally with the idea that when you're at war, the war for you is who's nearby and what happens. And a lot of times you're not connected to the politics or the strategy as closely as the people well above you. And the book dwells there. But these wars existed under a conceptual failure, in my view. And the Marines and the soldiers who I knew mostly felt like no matter what they were doing, they didn't have enough resources. They didn't have enough people. There weren't enough helicopters even to keep them resupplied in many areas in the central periods of the war. And so I have a way of, I want to define the conceptual failure to understand what we asked of our young soldiers and Marines. So Iraq and Afghanistan both have more than 30 million people, more than 30 million citizens. One has about 37, the other has about 31, but let's round it down and call it 30 to keep the numbers easy, envelope kind of numbers. At peak in Iraq, we had, what, maybe 160,000 Americans on the ground in uniform, and at peak in Afghanistan, we had about 100,000. So that doesn't mean anything, right? It doesn't make any sense to you. It's hard to relate to that. Those are just numbers. So let's talk about something that you can relate to that has about 30 million residents. The state of Texas has a little bit less than 30 million residents. I ask this all the time, who thinks we could take 160,000 troops or 100,000 troops to the state of Texas and reorganize the place? I mean, what were we thinking? You can't blame this on the rank and file. They'll do what we ask them to do when and where we ask them under the circumstances we put them in. But I really think these were conceptual failures. And from conceptual failure, practical failure follows. I don't say this with any joy. This is a sorrow.
Has the Pentagon ever reached out to you about this?
The interesting thing is, like, when people think of the Pentagons, they think of colonels and brigadiers and the like, right? And everyone below running around. The wars have gone on long enough that, like, I'm not going to sit here and disrespect our colonels. They were lieutenants and captains at the start. They lived it. Our lieutenant colonels were platoon commanders and the like in these wars. They're a pretty informed bunch at this point. No, I think the failure is systemic. It's above colonels. It's above brigadiers. It's larger. It's part of it is, I mean, I have an argument that I frame all the time, and I mean, take off your shoes and you're ready to throw them at me, but I believe that when we did away with the draft, we did away with realistic warfighting because we disconnected the population from the practice of warfighting. We have an all-volunteer force now. Roughly 3 million people in uniform went to these two wars. Less than 1% of our country. We can fight a war for 15 years with 1% of the country? Yes, turns out, because we did. But what it means is they're not really politically represented. They and their families don't even reach the 10% threshold of the country. If, however, the nation and its people were connected to the wars by mail lottery, So every household had to wonder whether or not their sons and daughters, nieces and nephews and grandchildren might have to go to the war. I think the country would pay attention. I mean, you're a Marine, so everyone in the room has probably heard what I'm going to read now. This was written on the door of the government center in Ramadi in 2007, you know, arguably like in a period of one of the worst moments of the war, 2007. And it was early, it was January, before the surge had gotten any traction. It said, America is not at war. The Marine Corps is at war. America is at the mall. I think that's accurate. And I think it's baked into the all-volunteer force that we've separated the fighting class from the rest of the country. And by doing that, one of the checks and balances on our strategy, the population is not paying attention. They're shopping. I mean, that's a pejorative construction, but to say it more nicely and understandably, the thing you don't have to worry about is the thing you don't think about, right? So you don't really have to worry about your family participating in the war. I'd argue there's a pretty good chance that you don't. And the shame of this is this wonderfully talented, deeply committed, all-volunteer force, which when I came into it in the early 80s, we were told by the conscripts who now were sergeant majors and first sergeants and were running the Marine Corps, you're so lucky you came in when we didn't have a draft anymore. That, and we got urinalysis now. We're not all stoned. And we have a volunteer force. The Marines we have today all want to be here. It's so much better than having 5 or 6 shitbirds in every platoon who didn't want to be here. And I think that's true. I don't have any argument with that. But the thing that exists side by side with that is we have a force that doesn't come from most of America. And that's a shame. It's a sorrow again. I've used the word twice now. I'll get to it again before you yank the mic out of my hand.
I want to follow up on that question a little bit. Who is this book for? I assume many of the folks who are reading this book have served or have family members who are served. And many of those that are touched by your words have lived these wars. How do we, and we come to events like this, and we nod in agreement, or we talk about the big picture, or we talk about the draft. How do we break through to get the attention of the other 99% of the population?
So let me take it in parts. So I know exactly who the book's for. In the first instance, it was for me. I'd done, just like I described that for the rank and file, war is who you're with and whatever happens. That was the case with me too. I kept going back and forth, and I had not yet tried to make it cohere in my own head. I was too busy trying to learn the new units that I was attaching to and trying to learn the people in them, try to figure out their mission, try to figure out the enemy situation where they were, and then trying to write something small and coherent in real time. That took all my bandwidth. I didn't have anything more to really ask myself, maybe shamefully, the bigger question. So the first instance, this was an effort to try to make it cohere in my mind. But that's one reader, that's not enough. You can't make a living writing a book for one person. Big bunch of the readership are the people who served during these wars. I saw this book as some ways an act of validation for them, that someone understood them, that someone took them at their word, someone was interested in what their experience was, separate from the national project above them, separate from how that fared. I wanted their experience written down, and I had a purpose for that. The purpose, I mean, when the wars broke out, I happened to be at the World Trade Center when 9/11 happened, entirely by chance, and it reordered my life. When the wars broke out, I was in my early 30s. I wasn't that many years out of the Marine Corps. I was still reasonably fit. Infantry officers in the Marine Corps never lose their hard drive, right? The chip that goes in your head stays there. You all know what I'm talking about. So I had a certain tactical and weapons fluency that existed really only in a very few people in American journalism. So I felt committed to going to cover these wars. I thought I had to. I saw myself as I did this as sort of a cultural bridge. I understood Marines and cared about Marines. I understood soldiers and cared about soldiers. I know a lot about what motivated them. I saw them as decent, good people in very difficult circumstances. And I thought part of my life mission became trying to demonstrate who they were. Again, whatever the politics are, I don't care. Who are the people? So in the end, this thing that I described as an act of validation for the people in the rank and file. It's also meant to be, I wanted to write a book that other 99%, if they read it, you only read this book, it's purposefully not that long, you can get through it in a few nights, that if you spend time with one book, if you have time, most people don't, that when you get to the end of it, you'll understand something about who served. That was it. You understand the people, whatever your politics are. So I wanted to create something for everyone else that they could know a little bit about what it was like, again, regardless of your politics.
So after getting these stories out on paper, how do you feel?
Well, you can tell. I thought this would be more cathartic than it was. I left the book more angry than I started. I think it's probably natural. I didn't see that coming. You know, the Marines who come home and soldiers who come home are told if they journal and they go to therapy and they write, that process can be cathartic, and it is. It maybe if I was writing my own story, it would have been. My old story's boring. I'm sick of myself. I'd never write my own. But when you take on everybody else's story, in addition to your own, when you're doing these interviews and many of the people are breaking down during the interviews and crying, and then you realize why they're crying, you know, my anger level rose to probably unhealthy levels. I don't really mask it. I think that's part of the whole experience and I should share it. So I got to the end and, you know, I didn't feel like I was done. I feel like I probably had to start over and do more. We can't tell these stories enough.
So what's next for you? You're at the magazine now?
So I work on long projects at the New York Times Magazine. Many of my stories take 4, 6, 8 months to work on. I spent much of a year ago working on a Marine Lance Corporal who was incarcerated in an Illinois prison for a crime he didn't remember. And I tried to understand him and his combat tour. Again, as sort of a cultural bridge, I saw him as an archetypical story of the war, of a misunderstood kid who did, in infantry terms, incredible things in Afghanistan, but who came home and they just didn't fit into his life anymore. I'm working now on a very, very long project about the evolution of IEDs, how they changed, and what that means for our forces, because I have some theories about what the evolution of IEDs mean. And to do that, I'm reconstructing a number of bomb attacks against our forces across many years. It's a big consuming project, and I'm tracing the parts back to where they came from. And I have a wonderful wife and 5 children, and I mean, that takes all my time. I will set out soon, I'm sure, to write another book. I haven't one in mind that's narrower in scope, shorter in duration, related to some events that happened in a particular province in Afghanistan. So I'm not done writing about the wars. But I'm slow, so you're not going to read that book for 3 or 4 years, I think.
Well, I have a thing where when I read a book, I read the last couple pages just in case I die. I want to know what happens. And I did that with your book, and I regret it, so I don't recommend folks do that. But I might ruin it a little bit because it touched me so much. And if you'd like to read, or if you would like me to read just a scene with Gail and the mom.
Let me just set it up. So we talked about Doc. A few minutes ago, I opened with reading about Doc when he saved his roommate Colin Smith's life. Doc later was wounded himself grievously. He was shot through the mouth laterally in one cheek and out the other. Ballistically, you could make that shot 10,000 times and only one person would live. It was Doc. He survived it. He lost a bunch of teeth, part of his tongue, a chunk of his jaw, shattered his sinuses, and set him on a terrible, terrible downward spiral from being one of the central figures in his company. Doc was revered for his energy and attitude and skills, to being alone, disfigured, heading towards divorce, on too many pills and medication, then self-medicating with alcohol, then discharged medically from the Navy and losing all sense of belonging and social connection and sense of common purpose, to being home in a depressive funk and committing suicide, or attempting suicide, and then beginning the recovery out of that. He tried to drive his truck off the road at about 100 miles an hour And kind of like the bullet that went through his mouth that didn't kill him, he rode his Chevy into the trees and survived somehow. And was charged with reckless driving for that and put on probation. And then, and this is where it comes, he was invited to see President Bush, who's made it a mission, to his great credit, to meet many of our service members and sit with them. And so Doc was invited on very short notice, like literally one afternoon, be here the next morning to see President Bush at his library in Texas. And Doc brought his whole family, including his mom, who had saved his life. And Doc, being Doc, didn't have much to say for the president. He kind of stuck to the script. Yes, sir, no, sir. You all know the type. You lived the type. But his mom wasn't bound by those traditions. Now it's your turn, Kate.
Gail was not happy. We're going to start here. It goes, "Did you hear him?" she said to Bush. "He told you about that truck accident like it was nothing." She wanted Bush to know the truth. Too many people must sugarcoat things for him. Why should the Kirby family hide what it had endured? He tried to kill himself by driving his truck into a tree at speeds in excess of 120 miles an hour, she said. "I am not the same mom who sent her son to Iraq. I am different now." Doc squirmed in his chair. Buzz Kelly thought. She was running the ritual and undercutting him in front of his former commander-in-chief. Damn, he thought. He was proud of me. Gail did not stop. This was her turn. "It would have destroyed us if he had been killed," she said. "I know," Bush said. She took her eyes off Bush to look at her oldest boy. "Dustin," she said. "Mom," he answered. "It would have destroyed us." Bush looked at Doc, too. The former president had turned serious and set his face. "Were you drunk," he asked, "or just being stupid?" Dustin remembered that drive that night, the desperation, the last miles before the deliberate crash, the sound of the tires hissing on the road, the release as he chose the moment to die. He could feel that desperation. People did not know what coming home from war was like, much less coming home maimed and in pain. He was displeased with his mother. Here she is, blaring all my shit out at the president, he thought, but nothing that could be said in this meeting could be as bad as his despair. "I wasn't really thinking about anything other than giving up on my situation," he said. "I didn't feel like I had anything going. I felt like I wasn't what I was and I didn't have anything left. And that's it," he thought, honesty. He waited for Bush's reply. None came. The meeting had turned. Gail was driving now. She kept going, talking fast, seeking reassurance that Doc's wounds had not been for nothing. She needed to know that this man had really been in charge. "You did know what you were doing, right?" she asked. "But let me tell you what it was like for a mom when her son goes to war." Gail had prepared a monologue and practiced its lines overnight. The president would listen to her script. "I realize that you may not understand what you are going through as a parent while your child is serving in a foreign country during the war. You may not have a son that is serving, but you do have a grandchild that you are completely in love with." She stared at the president and held his gaze. He looked back. She plunged on. "Now picture that baby being out in the car seat in the middle of a highway, a very busy highway with hundreds of cars that are zooming past him all day long. You know in your heart that your baby will be safe as long as no cars swerve just a little bit. You pray every minute of every day that those cars stay away from that yellow line and your baby in the car seat. That is exhausting enough, but to make it even harder, you'll be put in an office with a TV that is playing the footage of those cars driving past your baby every minute of every day of weeks on end. To make it even more realistic, there are hundreds of other babies dressed exactly like your baby in the same state-of-the-art car seat, lying on the yellow line, as far as your eyes can see. You know in your heart that every baby has a mom praying as hard as you are. But you pray even harder now." She kept talking, barely allowing for breath, allowing no pause for the president to interrupt. She looked Bush in his eyes. "You get absolutely exhausting watching the TV every minute that you can leave, and only leave when it's necessary. And then it happens. One of the cars swerves just enough to clip your baby. Is it yours? Is the baby dead? Oh God, tell us something. If it is, the phone will ring or there will be a knock on the door. You wait and you pray even harder, dying a little every second that passes. The special report comes on and it's not your baby. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Then the road is cleared and the cars are speeding past those babies again. So you go back to watching all those cars again. You are so thankful that it's not your baby that you celebrate for a minute and then it hits you. It's someone else's baby. Then the guilt pours over you like a heavy blanket, adding to the exhaustion that you already feel. But all you can do is watch TV because you know that it all will end for next time for the baby. Then one day a car swerves and it's your baby. It's your baby that was hit. Gail stopped. She turned to her son. He sat bolt straight in his chair. He couldn't believe what he had heard. His mother was going after the man, the commander-in-chief, like she was in charge, not him. Damn, Doc was thinking, wow. She turned back to Bush. He sat He had sat through her monologue silently, maintaining eye contact, shifting slightly in his chair. Now he looked around the room at all the tense faces. Each member of the Kirby family was waiting for him to react. Jacko had braced for anger, expecting a thunderclap. That's the President of the United States, he thought. Nobody talks to him like that. Gail did not care. Her son had been shot. She had not come here for a ceremony or to be denied her agency or right to speak. Butch's demeanor was gentle. He leaned forward. That's quite the analogy, he said. I am so sorry, he said. I am responsible. I know I sent him there. Gail had grown used to people changing the subject. The aftermath of the wars had beyond what many people wanted time or heart to hear. The Kirby story was long, and it was just a small part of it all. But she had unloaded on Bush, and he was still listening. Her family's experience was being validated. She was carried away by the experience of being heard. He's not like so many other people, she thought. He respects us. These veterans deserve respect, she thought. Gail Kirby felt herself relax. Her concentration drifted. The rest of the meeting was a blur of small talk and coffee before Bush asked the guests if they would like to get their picture taken. This was their signal to go. Gail led Jacko to Doc's siblings to the room for the shoot. For a moment, Bush and Doc were one-on-one. The president had shown his disappointment in Doc's post-war slide. He seemed alarmed at Gail's description of a man who had saved others' lives and later chose to drive his truck off the road and end his own life. Not many people step into the president's office like this. With his scars and tattoos, his beard and baseball cap, Kirby could be mistaken for anger personified. He was not. He had survived the leader's bad ideas and Karma's efforts to kill him through a chain of disaster as a lens alive. His mouth was a mess. His eyes retained the brightness of youth. Bush suggested that no one should waste such a gift. Countless mistakes had brought them here, along with crimes to shame the world. The former president smiled, held up his right hand, and gave the corpsman a fist bump. Make better decisions, Bush said. And that's how you end the book. And I cried in Barnes & Noble reading this and yelled.
So, what you think of Bush is between you and you. I'm not asking, but he did something very decent there, letting this one corpsman into his space and listening to his story and listening to his family's experience. I get asked a lot what we can do for our veterans, and you know, the first thing is listen to them, understand them. When I separate, again, all politics, I give credit to anyone who had authority over these wars, who spends time with those who actually served in them. And that's part of what that scene's about. Gail Kirby, for her anger and anxiety as she met Bush, came out of that room changed. She thought she'd been heard, and she respects the president for listening to her. It was a very big moment in her own recovery, was the chance to get to look into the eyes of the commander-in-chief and articulate her feelings and have him accept them for what they were.
How is Doc Kirby now?
Doc's doing surprisingly better. I mean, right? Doc got a job. He's working in pipeline construction in the Midwest. Doc has 2 children with a woman who had 2 children from another father. And so Doc went from this crushing, unbelievable loneliness to having a really busy family. And he's taken on the role of providing for it. And he also got a pro bono surgery to have his face rebuilt again. And this time it lined up. The bottom jaw actually matches with the top jaw. And about 6 months after that surgery, when things had firmed up, he bit through an apple, right clean through. I mean, we take that for granted at his age. He hadn't done it in years. So at the moment, knock wood again, Doc has done much better, better than I would have predicted. I mean, I've followed Doc for 12 years now, known him a long time. And around about 2011 and 12, I would not have seen the Doc I'm seeing today. I'm very proud of him.
You mentioned not having enough resources to effectively drive change in Iraq and Afghanistan. But is there a fraction within the Marines that question the purpose of those wars? It seems arbitrary that we choose to go to wars in those countries while at the same time staying cozy with Saudi Arabia. What are your thoughts?
Let me stay within my lane. I mean, you're looking at me. I'm not that bright. I'm not that well trained in strategy. I have no strategic fluency, and I won't pretend to. Nations make unseemly compromises. Our nation has made many unseemly compromises. I'm not here to critique them. Other people can do that. Like the person who wrote the questions, I have a lot of questions about our foreign policy, but I'm not your best commentator on it. I inhabit a lower level of the ecosystem. That's my place. That's what I speak to. So I just ducked you.
Okay, thanks. All right, we have Katherine, who I believe is an RN at a VA hospital. Can you speak about your experience with and thoughts about the VA healthcare system?
Sure, I can do that, because that does very much intersect with the low-level experience of the war. I see the VA as a lottery, kind of a geographic lottery. There are a lot of, I mean, you don't hear about the good VA hospitals and the good VA care, but I know a lot of people who are satisfied with their care. It really seems to depend on who's caring for you, which facility you go to, which clinic within the facility, which nurse, which doctor, which audiologist, which physical therapist, which programs they offer off-site, who they're engaged with in their community. This has led many people I know to be satisfied with their VA care. And then there's the other side that you all hear. So I don't speak about the VA generally. I know a lot of people who it's failed. I know a lot of people who it's helped. I would say one thing, that what I just described maybe isn't much different than American medical care writ large across our communities. Medical care in the country's not evenly and well distributed. Some of that's geographic. I mean, but I mean, you know, even then though, like, you know, you can have in attractive houses, people have different insurance plans based on their employer or their age or their connection to the government, and they can all have very different experiences medically with similar problems. Although I think the VA does have some particularly acute problems at the private sector here and there that don't exist in the private sector. But it is a lottery. That's how I see it. I can't really speak generally because I have examples in my own social world from, you know, both extremes and everything in the middle.
This is Lisa, so we'll stay on the healthcare topic. What are your thoughts on how the VA can help veterans with PTSD and CTE? It has been an impossible journey for assistance due to the severe moral injury in addition to the physical.
So I have to say the same thing. I mean, I don't, having not studied the program enough, I've got to be careful. If I don't have a fluency in it, I'm not going to discuss it much. Generally, I think veterans who come home with psychic or moral struggles need help. And I have something that I think is the number one thing that helps people. And having just given this talk about all this violence, you might be surprised at what it is. There's one thing, you'll see it in the book, the people who come out the back end of the book doing better, it's unstated, but it's there, and we see it in all our lives. You know what that thing is? The main thing that saves people or makes them have better outcomes? Love. That's what it is. It's your families. It's your relationships. It's your children that give you a sense of purpose and open up reservoirs of love that a young Marine or soldier might not even know exists in him or her when they're 19 or 25, but they realize when they're 30 and they're having their families. The people who I know who have done best get into good relationships. The relationships become the center of their community. That's not a recommendation for the VA. Obviously, the VA is not in the matchmaking business, although a lot of veterans do marry each other and they meet in places like the VA. But what is love? I mean, love is mutual caring, right? It's connection. And those things exist in communities too. And a lot of the people I know who've done well coming home and have integrated well get into, let's call them sort of light replicas of their military units, whether it's their church, or their gym, or their fishing club. They find an other sense of commonality with people. And that's one of the main things that helps people feel at place again. You know, you served your country, you might as well come back to your country. You might as well come back to your country on good footing and have the life you deserve. And love and community are the things that you need for that. It's not exactly an answer to your question, but I also think the VA isn't the source of all healing. The final source of healing is in our own communities, in our own families.
How can we help POTUS and Congress make more informed decisions regarding war and deploying troops?
Have a draft. I just covered that already. We're not going to have a draft, right? This is a thought exercise. It's meant to provoke you. I hope you feel provoked. But we have as much chance having a draft in this country as any of you doing growing tomatoes on the dark side of the moon. We're not doing it. But I propose that as a way to imagine, wow, how do you think your neighbors would be paying attention to the war if their high school junior might have to show up to it for it in 2 years? But what am I really talking about? We're talking about national popular engagement, the population being connected to the wars. I don't know how we get that. I work in the media. I write these stories. I dedicated a big swath of my life to trying to understand these. And I have a certain following, but set against the larger country, it's not that much. And we can see now, I'm not a numbers person on the clicks, you know, as you measure stories that get read on the internet, but we have those people. We've got a bunch of people, young people in red sneakers, you know, millennial wrenches who can figure out where the traffic is on what gets covered, and the war coverage doesn't get much coverage, or doesn't get much attention. People don't do it. I don't know how we get the engagement. My idea about the draft, the provocation of that idea, is to say we need the countries paying attention to the wars. I'm in a business that seeks attention and presents ideas to the public, and we're not able to really engage at a great depth across the population with what these wars are about. So I don't know the answer. Maybe we need better politicians. Right.
Of all the perspectives you provide in your account of the wars, war correspondent, U.S. Marine Corps veteran, civilian, which is most important?
Oh, you know what I think probably made my writing at best? Becoming a father. I think that's what did it. It opened up a richer empathy that I had and gave me a different value for human life that I had before. I think that's what I draw from probably the most. The Marine mentality, which we all mostly retain, or we even had in some cases in the all-volunteer force when we volunteered to go in, we had some of it in us, and it's certainly sharpened and polished and repurposed by the Marine Corps. That stays with you, and the knowledge base that I have as a Marine, and the social life that I have inside the Marine Corps and the veteran ranks. I have friends in the room. There's a gentleman who I went to OCS with. There's my former division commander is in the room. I have a gentleman who was a fire support officer during the large Marine assault that we described in 2010. The social life helps, I draw from that, but I think mostly it's being a father that changes how I see these wars.
Can you tell us a little bit about the title of your book?
Yeah, I wanted a plain, simple title. I also didn't want to get that involved in the title selection. There's sort of a committee that does that. Your agent and your editors and the publisher of the book all got involved in that. We thought about different titles, some sort of, quote from scripture or from the Iliad or from Shakespeare, or something evocative. The book is purposely written very flat. It's not a writerly book. I tried to take and switch down and tamp down the voice and let the facts and the people rise up and not have the reader having to wade through a lot of flowery prose. So we didn't have a lot of flowery phrases to put on the title. Ultimately, I wanted and everyone agreed, a simple title that doesn't carry a particular political or historical resonance. It just says what it is. It's a book about the people who fought your wars in these two wars. And I wanted to signal that we were talking about combatants, not really supervisors, not politicians. And the book doesn't have much of them in it. So we just chose something we thought was very, very simple. And we didn't market test it or anything like that. I wanted it, in order for it to reach the most amount of people, I thought it shouldn't be a blue book or a red book. It shouldn't be designed for one type of reader or another. It should be there for everyone, and that I think we just chose a plain title, a simple declarative title that I hope achieves that.
Can you discuss your feelings on being a Marine officer leading your unit in LA where fellow Americans were your opponent?
I mean, the Marine Corps exists for moments of failure, right? By the time you deploy your Marine Corps, something's gone bad, whether it's a tsunami, a riot, a war, an occupation. Something wasn't working. Going into, I told you I'd use the word for a third time, going into Compton and Los Angeles after some of the citizens were rioting there, and after there was a popular belief that the court system had failed to prosecute the officers who'd beaten Rodney King, felt like a sorrow to me. But many of the people in the room are Marines, so we just did our job as it was assigned to us. I have to say, we were a little bit lucky. Riots only last so long. People get tired. They're often not that well organized. The riots broke out Thursday night. Friday morning, we were having a Charlie's inspection. You all remember that? Oh my God. We were having a Charlie's inspection. So I was, the riots were breaking out. I was ironing my trousers, We went in Friday morning for a Charlie's inspection. The colonel came out and said, it's happened to many of the Marines in the room. Grab your shit, you're going. Go get your camis on, and go to the armory, and we'll be back to you when we know what the transport is. And a few hours later, we were driving north. And it was a moment of failure. The society had failed. The Marine Corps had a service to provide. But, in truth, by the time we got there, it had mostly quieted down. And then I watched a Marine officer do something I thought was pretty incredible. There's a lot of different tools in your toolbox. When you have, we took a battalion plus the headquarters company, so we probably had about 1,000 Marines. I think LAVs came along too. Probably had more than 1,000 Marines who went north. And, we were all 20-somethings, and we weren't really trained in what we were being asked to do. And the colonel, as we came north on Route 5 in the convoys, we had news helicopters flying overhead and all that stuff, and there were people on the side of the road cheering. It was very bizarre. And the colonel pulled us into an air base near Los Angeles to hand out ammunition. Because we moved without ammunition, and the ammunition was following us or was coming from somewhere else, so we had to fill magazines. And the news crews TV crews were waiting all around to get access to the colonel. And the colonel invited him in, and he had a company or two do a troop and stomp, riot control drills, advancing on the cameras, who went live into Los Angeles. There's footage of the Marines doing the stomp and the NCOs calling it out and advancing with the shields and riot helmets. I thought that was an incredible use of an unexpected tool. It projected a message that the Marines are going to be in, give us about 90 minutes, we're going to be on the street corners. And look at these guys. Do you really want to steal a TV set that badly? And when we went there for the first few days, I don't recall any problems at all. I think that he did a great job of signaling, and that powerful, strong signaling, protected everyone. Protected the rioters, protected the troops, protected the people, because there was a sense that whatever the disorder has been up to this moment, there's people here who are not going to tolerate it. And I think that the fact that the riots were calming down on their own, it was now day 2, and people were, the stores had been looted, had in many cases been looted. I think that led to a quiet Friday night. I remember Friday night as being exhausting because we didn't sleep, but uneventful.
As a member of the GWOT generation, there is a feeling that some of the veteran organizations, such as the American Legion and VFW, are for the older generations. How do we connect our most recent generation of veterans to maintain their camaraderie that they miss when they leave the service? Is the solution social media?
So the younger guys, you all know that your units are all networked together on Facebook, right, and in discussion groups. And your MOS and the provinces you fought in, there's like the Kunar Veterans Association, there's the 126 Association, there's the EOD boards, and there's all these boards where people cluster on social media, and they're mostly healthy, although they're not entirely. But they don't have proximity. They're not what a veterans hall gives you. And some of the veterans groups now for the younger generation exist kind of like flash mobs. They don't really have spaces. They rent them or you meet. But I don't think the VFW is completely out of the picture. There are some chapters of the VFW where young people have gotten involved and rebuilt the properties. There's one in Denver, right? Post 1, which is incredibly active with young veterans. So again, it's kind of like the VA. It is a little bit of a lottery, and I met, you know, depending on where you live geographically, and I met one of the gentlemen who runs Post 1 a few weeks ago. I met him in Colorado Springs, and I was talking about the VFW in my town, which is basically an empty bungalow house with almost no one in it. And I don't think they have any of the younger veterans in it who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he had a very simple answer. Join it. They'll welcome you. They want you. The older generation wants to know you. You join it, and you've got the energy. Participate. Take it over. He wasn't talking about a coup. He was talking about a passing of a torch. That's what they did in Denver. Because these older generations own physical spaces, which are better than the internet in many ways. So I'm not going to diss the VFW or the American Legion or the Vietnam Veterans organizations, because they serve generations very, very well. And because the generation has gotten older, we can't knock them because they're not as active as people in their 20s and 30s who are out now. I mean, I think if you want a space, go get a space. If you want a crowd, go get a crowd. I mean, it's on us. We don't have to have things handed to us. If we really want to do it, we can.
Okay. Those that protested the Vietnam War were those that were the draftable student movement, and not the moms, dads, and uncles. They asked, why are you opposed to the war? What stops us from going to the war?
War is what you do when other things have failed. We should have as many people as we can involved in trying to decide what failure looks like, and then what the war looks like, and then having a realistic strategy. What do I mean by realistic strategy? I mean exactly what it sounds like, a realistic set of goals. What are we trying to achieve? How do we know when we achieved it? And how do we organize our resources to achieve it as quickly as possible? It's a conversation. Maybe this exists in our country now, but I haven't accessed it, and I ask a lot of people. I mean, can anyone tell me what the strategy is in those terms, what we're trying to achieve in Afghanistan, and what it looks like when we get there, and are we organizing our resources to get there quickly, or are we adrift? So you're suggesting I have no quarrel with if you can bring other countries into it. I don't think it's the answer to all of them, though, because there'll be times when when countries have individual interests that might part with other nations. But again, I'm very careful about talking about strategy, and I would quarrel with one thing that you said about the draft. The draft eventually did put brakes on the Vietnam War, and I think one of the main results of the all-volunteer force is it extinguished the anti-war movement. So there's a correlation. We can argue about where the needle lies on the scale, and I don't know, every study would probably give you a slightly different answer depending on the war and the society. But all these things in principle are about checks and balances. And as reasonable people, we should believe in checks and balances, unless we're in absolute and extremist circumstances, you know. There's no time to talk about ROE. If someone comes in here with a gun right now, we're going to jump up and rush them and beat them up, right? We're going to stop them, right? There are circumstances like that I can see a nation would be in, but most circumstances aren't like that. The wars of my lifetime. So to answer your question, I'm for checks and balances wherever they come from.
Do you ever see yourself writing a book like this about women service members?
There are women service members in this book. I remember I covered the infantry, and I would go out for months and months and not see any women until I started covering helicopter units, and the helicopter units were loaded with incredible medics, crew chiefs, and pilots, because they'd been integrated long before, and a number of them are in the book. And it's not a coincidence that the last chapter centers on a woman, a mom. Yes, I could see myself writing a book that includes more women if we stay at these wars, because I'll be able to cover them. But the integration of the rank and file infantry units, which is my central subject, is only just begun. It hasn't really come to the Special Forces yet. And in the Marine Corps, I mean, there's people in the room who probably know the numbers, but we have a few dozen infantry women, infantry Marines who are female, a few dozen probably, one officer that I can think of. And in the Army, I think we have a few hundred. So it hasn't really hit a critical mass where, at the way I was covering the war, I was going to intersect with it. That's separate from the question of whether women should be in combat. Wherever people stood on that over the course of their careers, I saw women do incredible, unbelievable things in combat. I'll tell you one quick story as I got the mic for the end. I was flying with a dust-off medevac unit. They are the Black Hawk units that have medics in the back of one aircraft, and they're followed by a chase aircraft which have some machine guns on it that flies as their escort. And they go do exactly what it sounds like. They evacuate the wounded and pick up the dead on the battlefield. It's a very hairy job. And I was spending time with them, flying with them. One of the pilots on one of these missions was a woman, Amy, from West Point. And she was a very good pilot. And we had gone out. There was a call. Basically, what this means in practical terms is there's a couple of helicopters on the gravel and a couple of tents nearby, and you sleep in the tents. There's a radio center there, and when the calls come in, you run out and jump on the aircraft, and you fly. And the American military was brilliant at picking up their wounded on the battlefield in almost all circumstances, except in really bad weather. And so you do this repeatedly throughout the tour. And they got a call from a Special Forces unit that had hit an improvised explosive device out in the mountains beyond the steppe outside of Kandahar. So it was a long flight, probably a half an hour out, and there was an Afghan who was near death. He was riding around with the Special Forces, an Afghan soldier in flammable uniforms, like our old NATO woodland cami types, and he was on a four-wheeler, didn't have much armor, so he'd been hit with shrapnel, blast wave, and then fire. And it looked like when we got to him, most of his uniform had burned off of him, and his skin was burned. He was so burned that it was they couldn't get an IV in him. They actually used a DeWalt drill to drill into his knee and inject fluids into his bone marrow. He was near death. And Amy's crew picked him up and flew. It was like a half an hour back, and the medics worked on him, and it was pretty clear that he had very little chance of survival. He was dying. And there's a caste system in play at this time in the wars. When the Americans and NATO soldiers were wounded, they went to one hospital, the NATO Roll 3 hospital, which was world class. And when Afghans were wounded, they went to a hospital called Camp Hero, which the medics darkly called Camp Zero, because that was your chance of survival if you got left there. And the orders came to Amy to take the Afghan to Camp Zero. She refused. He's going to die. My patient's going to die. I don't remember exactly the dialogue, but I had a headset on. I heard it. But you would get the gist of the conversation. No, this guy needs the better hospital. And she was told again, take him to Camp Hero. She refused. She flew right past Camp Hero and landed on the tarmac next to the NATO Roll 3 hospital at the Kandahar airfield. Usually, when a Black Hawk helicopter with a patient set down there, people sprinted out with litter. These teams, and picked up the wounded and then ran them as quickly as they could without tossing them onto the asphalt, ran them into the trauma center where there was immediate extraordinary care. We sat there and no one came out. No one came out. We sat there, I don't know how long, it seems like an hour, it's probably like a minute, I don't know. But no one came out. It was very, very different than any other time. You'd see them as you were coming down, you'd see the crews crouched, ready to run at the aircraft ordinarily. There was no one coming out. It was clear that Amy was being stood up. So what did she do? She stepped out of the aircraft, left her seat, climbed down onto the ground, onto the deck, went around back, grabbed the medics, picked up the patient, and carried him to the gate and shamed them all. Should women not be in combat? My position on this was that when I get shot, someone make sure she's around, right? And under the rules at the time, and I've written this, we haven't published it yet, under the rules at the time, Amy couldn't go to Ranger School. As a West Point captain of extraordinary accomplishment, and great fiber, she couldn't go to Ranger School. And I think she'd been a college soccer player as well, so she was physically up to all the standards. How could it be that the gutsiest person in that aircraft couldn't go to the Army's premier, small unit leadership school? I mean, whatever people think or bombard me on social media because I talk about women being in combat, I think about Amy, and I feel very secure in my position. An example, one more story. We're going to run over the clock, but so what? Dan was there. So you'd get in these brief gunfights with very accomplished militants, Taliban guys, or maybe they weren't Taliban. Maybe they were just local villagers who didn't want the Marines there. And they'd hammer away at you with the AK, 2 of them over here, and you'd orient and go over there, and then 2 of them would fire from over there, so you'd orient. It was very confusing. It was like playing the Harlem Globetrotters in basketball. And you're wearing all this equipment. The Marines are wearing all the equipment. But the Marines are savvy. They figure out the pattern after a while, and they got radios that can't be listened to, so they'll flank them. They'll get another squad from another platoon to flank them. And suddenly, the Marines will spring their trap. They'll play their game. And some of the Marines will almost get them. They'll get up to the compound where these lightly equipped gunfighters have been harassing the Marines, and they'll run into the compound. We did this a couple of times. Run into the compound, and they're in the compound with you. And the Marines are charging in there like Marines always have, right? Just a full head of steam, top physical condition, great equipment, and they'll come to the back, and there's no one in the compound. And then they'll get to the back of the compound, there's a little mouse hole cut in the wall. Like a foot, or 18-inch square. And they've gone through there. And the Marine's about 40 inches across. Like a cork. And they'll sit there and they'll swear and they'll light a fucking cigarette and just be like, what the hell are we doing? I can't tell you how many times I saw this happen. I mean, it wasn't every day because you don't actually get that close to them that often. But it happened time and time again in the wars. The troops were over-equipped and the commanders were paralyzed by the rules and by the requirements after a casualty where they had to write a line in this, whether it's true or not, everyone wanted to write it in the statement when they took a casualty. The Marine, SNM, subject name Marine, was wearing all PPE, personal protective equipment. No one wanted to have a casualty and admit that they didn't have a guy with all the equipment on. And the equipment was, I don't know, what did it weigh, guys? You wore it 100 pounds on a good day? When you're ammo loaded and you got a few batteries, you might be carrying a couple mortar rounds, up 140 pounds sometimes. But the lightest you might go down to is maybe 80 pounds, flak jacket, ammo load, a little bit of water, brief patrol, no pack. And yeah, they got outran almost everywhere they went. Almost everywhere they went. It was like watching donkeys chase gazelles.
Okay, I think that's it. But Chris is going to be
You had enough
here.
of me by now.
No, he's going to be signing books and happy to take some of your questions. So thank you all for joining us and for
I'll be
hosting
over
us.
there.
Thank you.